This little doohickey is called the Dynamic Volume Chamber, and it comes from a small Australian-based company called SD Components. It's a sealed air chamber that replaces the standard top cap and bottomless token system in your RockShox Pike, Yari, Lyrik or Boxer fork. There's also a newly released version for Fox 36 forks too. Like the MRP Ramp Control cartridge, the DVC is designed to offer the rider extra adjustability over their fork's air spring behavior. How each design achieves that goal is very different though. Whereas the MRP unit alters spring behavior by manipulating the airflow rate through its adjustable valve, the DVC uses a pressurized chamber that can be adjusted using one of the two air valves on the top. The DVC essentially turns the fork into a triple air spring format, with two chambers for the positive spring, and one chamber for the negative spring. And why do that? Well, according to SD Components, it allows the user to adjust the first half of the air spring independently of the second half. This gives the ability to tune small bump and mid-stroke independently of bottom-out progression. The DVC is designed to replace the standard top cap and bottomless tokens in your RockShox Lyrik Pike era Boxer fork. But is that extra adjustability actually necessary? The latest Pike and Lyrik forks are very good performers, and surely the engineers at RockShox have their own thoughts about people installing hop-up kits into the products they've spent years designing, testing, refining and agonizing over. Needless to say, they probably won't be honoring your fork warranty if you start plugging in aftermarket kits into their forks. To find out just what the DVC could do, we hooked up Andrew with one to test on his personal bike for a couple of months. As well as having many years of bike industry experience as a bike brand road rep, Andrew is also a bike skills coach and a phenomenally quick enduro racer, regularly finishing in the top 10 in the vets class. Aside from knowing how to wrench on a bike, he's a very skilled rider. He takes up the story. The idea behind this funky-looking gizmo is similar to using bottomless tokens in the fork. Adding tokens allows you to make your air spring smaller and therefore ramps up the pressure inside the fork as it goes through its travel. A fork with no tokens will be more linear, and as you add tokens it gets more progressive. While there are many variables, in general heavier and more aggressive riders can benefit from running more tokens. This allows you to run a lower initial air pressure in the fork for a more supple feel in the early part of the travel, but with sufficient bottom-out control. Sounds good. In search of this magical balance, I've been experimenting with bottomless tokens in my 170mm travel RockShox Lyrik fork a lot over the past 9 months. I've tried running it with 0 tokens, and with as many as 5. Prior to testing the DVC, I've been running 3 tokens, which has allowed for a low initial pressure for small bump compliance and good support through the mid-stroke. However, I've still never actually bottomed out the fork. There, I've said it, I never bottom out my fork despite carrying around 170mm of travel. I only ever get about 155mm out of it. I've tried less pressure, but it dives more. Fewer tokens, same thing. I figured I needed to try something new, so as you can imagine, I was pretty intrigued when a broken Ross dropped the DVC into my lap to test out. Andrew's been running 3 tokens and 75 psi inside his 170mm travel RockShox Lyrik fork. First though, I wanted to check that my fork had a decent baseline setting. I borrowed the office shock was and off I went for some measured testing. 3 tokens in the fork as usual, I set up the shock was accordingly. That meant letting all the air out, then measuring the compression ratio by marking extension and compression of the fork. Once that was set, I reinflated the fork, and off we went. For reference, I weigh about 106 kilograms with riding gear, and I ride a suspension enduro bike with 160mm of rear travel. I set the fork as I would normally, with around 30% seg. On a side note, the shock was showing my air pressure at 75 psi, which was quite a way off from my analog shock pump that normally reads 60 psi. Seems like I might need to invest in a new shock pump at some point soon. That aside, the shock was confirmed my fork was set up correctly. All the lights were green on the app's recommendations, and everything seemed to be working well. However, I still wasn't getting travel. Nothing new there though. The DVC comes with a custom tool that helps you to remove the stock top cap. Fitting the DVC comes supplied with a custom tool, which is a beauty-made pin spanner that's used for installing the DVC via 2 corresponding holes in the top of the chamber. To remove your existing top cap, depressurize the air chamber, and use the opposite end of the pin spanner to lock onto the top cap and unwind anti-clockwise. From there, the DVC simply threads in and is tightened up with the pin spanner. The steel tool uses 2 pins to lock into the DVC. Just the tool in itself is a beautiful piece of machining. Based on the setup advice listed on the SD Components website, I stuck with 75 psi in the main air chamber valve 1, and went with 100 psi in the DVC chamber valve 2. Of note here is that you'll have to inflate the DVC first to 100 psi, before inflating the main air chamber to 75 psi second. On the first few rides, everything was feeling good, though to be honest, it wasn't too dissimilar from the previous token-based setup I had been using. As in, I still wasn't achieving travel. Once I had this base setting though, now I could tune the end stroke better. I wanted that same feeling, suppleness to begin with and support through the middle, but with the ability to use all of my travel. Referring back to the claims made on the DVC website, I thought I could use the dynamic nature of the DVC to help me. So I decreased the pressure in the DVC air chamber down from 100 psi to 85 psi. Because this affects the pressure inside the fork's main air chamber, I then rechecked that and adjusted it back up to 75 psi. The twin valves on the DVC do stick up quite a bit, which could be tight on some frames. On my first ride out with the changed pressure in the DVC, the fork felt downright amazing. I had exactly what I wanted, with a similar feeling in terms of small bump compliance and mid-stroke support, but now I was achieving travel. It must have been the DVC opening up and having slightly less ramp at the end compared to using a solid set of tokens. It worked an absolute treat. The lower pressure in the DVC and its dynamic nature, opening up halfway through the travel, meant I could get everything out of the fork. The end result was that my Lyrik felt nice and supple for maintaining tire contact on smaller rubble, while also feeling active on the bigger hits. At the end of the test, I had to remove the DVC to ship it back to Simon of SD Components in Australia. I refitted the stock top cap and bottomless token setup, and the difference was immediately noticeable on the first ride. Since then, I've been struggling to get the same floaty feel that I had with the DVC. I've actually gone back to one token, which has reduced the ramp up and has allowed me to get much closer to travel. That said, the travel now feels as you'd expect, a lot more linear, with less overall support once you pass the sag point, and that's noticeable on the faster and bigger stuff. In short, I miss the DVC. For this tester, the DVC offered extra tunability of the fork's spring behavior. Overall, for achieving your ideal fork setup, the DVC offers more adjustability and more flexibility in the spring's behavior. In my case, using the DVC meant I was able to retain the small bump sensitivity and mid-stroke support of my existing setup, but with a greater control of the ending stroke so I could access all of the travel. It isn't a cheap upgrade, and you really need to know how to adjust your fork properly in the first place. If you don't know what to look for, it's potentially another wasted adjustment that can increase the complexity of setup. However, there's no doubting this is a very well-made piece of kit, and I experienced enough benefits from the added adjustability that I am now seriously considering buying one for myself. Review info: Brand SD Components Product Dynamic Volume Chamber from SD Components, sdcomponents.com.au. Price $260, odd around £150. Tested by Andrew Me for 2 months.